Hi there, my name is Gerard Green. I'm a men's health physiotherapist based both in Birmingham and in central London. So I see big numbers of male patients who've got male pelvic floor related problems. So we see lots of men, and the kind of different groups of men we see lots of male patients who've got urinary problems. So they may have urinary incontinence or leakage. They may have urinary frequency, so they're having to go to the loo a lot. They may have some hesitancy or maybe pain on urination. We also see lots of patients, male patients with bowel issues. So that's where they may have some fecal incontinence or anal incontinence, which is a very distressing condition to have. We also see male patients who maybe have problems with controlling wind. And then another group of patients we see related to the pelvic floor are patients with erectile dysfunction. And the final big group that we're very passionate about seeing and helping is the men who've got a pelvic floor condition that becomes those muscles become a little bit too active and start to cause pain, and they are the pelvic pain men. And I've always been quite passionate about helping these men because I think men find it difficult to talk about problems relating to urinary leakage, erectile dysfunction, bowel leakage. And so those men tend to get very anxious, very distressed. They're not always brilliant at seeking help. And also, if they want to seek help, sometimes it's not easy for them to find someone who can help them. And I think when you do see those men, and we can do lots to help them, you then see those men change really. They become less distressed, less anxious, and they get back to enjoying life. I think probably the most important thing to say about the pelvic floor in men is that men have a pelvic floor. Because a lot of men, when everything's going really well, don't really have much to do with their pelvic floor. So I think that it's really important that men have a pelvic floor, and it's really important what that pelvic floor does. The pelvic floor is really important probably for three key things. A part of the pelvic floor wraps around the rectum, and that forms the specialist external or outer anal valve or sphincter. And you might think, well, what's that? So if I'm standing here and I feel I'm going to break wind, I can squeeze around the back passage, and I'm squeezing that anal sphincter. And a big part of that is made up of a loop of the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor in men, really important for bowel control. At the front part of the pelvic floor, the urethra, which is a small tube, comes out of the bladder, through the prostate, and below the prostate, it kind of pierces or runs through the pelvic floor, and the pelvic floor wraps around that to form the outer or external urethral valve or sphincter. And that's really important for urinary control. But it's particularly important for those men maybe who've gone through prostate cancer, had their prostate removed, and that external sphincter has to work much, much harder. And then the third thing that sometimes men don't associate the pelvic floor with is erectile function. So at the front of the pelvic floor, almost wrapped in behind or underneath the scrotum, we've got two muscles on each side, which are the bulbo and ischio muscles, and they are part of that outer pelvic floor, and they wrap into the base of the penis. So in order to get an erection, maintain an erection, to ejaculate, that pelvic floor works really hard. So the pelvic floor in men is really, really important for bowel function, urinary function, erectile function. And I think until things go wrong, we probably don't give it too much thought. When we look at how the male pelvic floor works, it's really important that we look at the different parts of it. And it's really worth emphasizing this. A lot of men maybe know a little bit about the pelvic floor bit that's at the back. which helps with bowel function. So if a lot of men are told to contract their pelvic floor, they might think, well, I'll squeeze around the back passage. So that's the posterior or rear part of the pelvic floor. So for patients who've got bowel symptoms, that's a really important part. However, we've got another important part at the front, which is much, much smaller. So anatomically, the urethral valve or sphincter is much smaller than the anal sphincter. So it's much harder for us as men to kind of find that, contract that. But in men who've got urinary symptoms and who need to do pelvic floor exercises, they really need to do very specific anterior or front focused exercises. And that's a really important thing. A bit like the other muscles in the body, it's a bit like if someone has a calf injury or a hamstring injury. Those muscles have got two types of fibers. So my calf muscle has fast twitch fibers. So if I need to move up the stairs quickly, I've heard something, I can sprint up the stairs. So those fast twitch muscle fibers will function high intensity, but for a short period of time. And then we've got slow twitch fibers, which would allow me to stand here for hours and hours and hours talking. So they won't fatigue. And the pelvic floor has fast twitch fibers. So they work when I cough, sneeze, move suddenly, go to lift something up, go from sit to standing. But I've also got slow twitch fibers in my pelvic floor. So they'll help to keep me continent when I'm maybe doing a long walk for an hour or so, or standing for an hour or so. And when we get to looking at pelvic floor exercises, it's important that the exercises you're doing has a fast twitch component and a slow twitch component. And then the final point is that if I'm sitting or lying, my pelvic floor doesn't need to do very much. If I've got urinary and bowel symptoms, I'll probably be okay if I'm sitting. Where I'll start to have problems is when I go from sitting to standing, when I bend down to take my shoes off, when I get into the car, when I lift my child or grandchild up, when I go to do some exercise. So in terms of pelvic floor exercises, it's really important that we do them in positions of standing, and then when they're easy to do in standing, we do them in harder positions such as lunging, squatting, adding some resistance in. A bit like other exercises, we progressively make it more difficult, but that's to reflect what your muscles have to do in your everyday activities.